Night fell upon the fortress, and the torches on the towers burned unevenly, as if shyly concealing a secret. Inside the castle, it was quiet, with only the footsteps of the guards echoing through the stone corridors. The princess sat by the window of her chambers, gazing into the darkness beyond the walls, where the forest stretched out. All day long she had been told that her fate had been decided. In a week's time she was to become the wife of the Duke, an old but influential man, whose greed and cold eyes left no room for hope in her heart. She felt like a prisoner, even though she had the wings of youth behind her. The servants were already laying out her wedding clothes, whispering about expensive fabrics and gold. But for her it was not a joy, but a heavy burden. Her heart had long belonged to another, a young squire at court. He was poor, had no title, his hands knew labor, and his face knew the dust of the roads. But in his gaze there was something that was not in the glitter of the Duke's treasures: lively warmth and sincere devotion. They met secretly, like thieves. Brief glances in the courtyard, a chance touch of the hand, quick words in the stables. It all seemed impossible, but that was what pushed them to a decision from which there was no turning back. Tonight they had to disappear. The princess knew that if her father found out, his wrath would be terrible, but she felt she could not live any other way. Better to risk everything than to fade away in a cage decorated with gold. She threw her cloak on the bed and placed a small bundle there: some bread, a knife, and her mother's pendant, the only memory of the woman who had died when she was a child. She had not chosen this pendant by chance. It seemed as if her mother herself was blessing her escape. At that moment, the squire was waiting by the stable, holding the reins of 2 horses. His heart was beating so loudly that he thought the guards would hear it. He remembered everything he had told himself over the last few days: that he had no right, that she was above him, that he could ruin her. But alongside these thoughts, the image of her face always appeared, and everything else lost its meaning. They met in the shadow of the tower. She stepped toward him without a word, and he just nodded, realizing there was no turning back. They climbed over the low part of the wall, where the guards were rarely on duty. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, and its silvery light revealed their figures gliding along the fortress walls. Her dress was covered by a cloak, his weapon hidden under the saddle. They felt like strangers in their own home, and for the first time, free. Soon the forest covered them with its thick canopy. The castle was left behind, like a heavy dream. Deep in the forest, the air was damp and cool. The horses walked quietly, as if they understood that their footsteps must not wake the night. For the first time in many years, the princess felt alive. She listened to the owl hooting somewhere in the distance, to the wind rustling the leaves, and it seemed to her like the true music of freedom. The squire turned around from time to check if anyone was following them. He knew that when the princess's disappearance was discovered in the castle in the morning, the whole kingdom would be put on alert. The Duke would not tolerate the disgrace, and the king would not forgive the audacity. They would be searched for in villages, on roads, and in monasteries. He understood that their chances were slim, but he still moved forward like a warrior who had nothing left to lose. They stopped at the river to water the horses. The princess sat down on a rock and covered her face with her hands. She was scared, but she had no regrets. At that moment, the squire put his hand on her shoulder. He said he would be with her until the end, even if that end was near. She nodded and allowed herself to smile in the darkness for the first time. The road led to a small village on the edge of the forest. An old woman lived there, whom the squire had known since childhood. She had once helped his mother with herbs and had always been kind. He hoped that they would be able to rest there. By morning, they had reached the village. People were already going out to the fields, and no one paid any attention to the travelers. The old woman welcomed them into her hut, set out a bowl of soup, and gave them dry clothes. She looked at the princess intently, as if trying to remember something. Then she sighed and said that the girl had the same eyes as a woman who had come here secretly many years ago with a small child in her arms. The princess was surprised because she knew that her mother had died in childbirth and had never left the castle. The old woman just shrugged, but her eyes flashed with a strange knowledge. They stayed with the old woman for a day, but by evening they had to leave. Rumors spread quickly, and a village shepherd could accidentally say too much. Before leaving, the old woman handed the squire a bag of coins. She said that her debt to his mother had weighed on her for many years, and now it was time to repay it. This gave them their first funds for the journey. They went deep into the forest again, trying to avoid the roads, but after a couple of days, it became clear that their pursuers were close. In the villages, people talked about horsemen with the duke's coat of arms who were scouring the area. People were afraid to answer questions, but rumors spread faster than the wind. At night, by the fire, the squire confessed to the princess that he was not afraid to die, but he was afraid for her. He felt that he had led her into danger. The princess replied that she had made her own choice, and if death awaited her, she would meet it by his side. These words became a vow for him, one he decided to fulfill at any cost. But they did not yet know that they had already left a trail that would lead their enemies straight to them. After 3 days of travel, the forest began to thin out, and hills appeared ahead. On one of them stood the half-ruined tower of an old castle. The locals avoided it, considering it cursed, but for the fugitives it was a salvation. Inside they found shelter. The stone walls were still standing, the roof was leaking, but the basement was dry. There they could hide from view and wait it out. The princess was tired. She was used to soft beds and being protected. But on the road, her face was covered with dust. Her hands were scratched, and her clothes had become simple and rough. The squire saw her suffering, but she never complained. On the contrary, she tried to stay close to him and helped as much as she could. In this, he noticed a strength in her that he did not expect from a girl who had grown up within the walls of a palace. One night, as they sat by the fire in the dungeon, he told her about his childhood. His mother had served at court, but died when he was still a boy. He did not know his father, and the other children teased him for being poor. The only thing he had left was a pendant with a coat of arms that his mother had kept, but she never explained its origin. The princess asked to see the pendant. When he took it out of his bag, she froze. Engraved on the metal was a symbol she had known since childhood. It was a mark from her mother's family jewelry. She was silent for a long time, and only then did she realize that he was not just a squire. He was connected to her family in some secret way, perhaps through a long-ago romance or a mistake from the past. She did not tell him everything, but a doubt arose within her. Perhaps their connection was much deeper than love. Meanwhile, the chase intensified. At dawn, they saw a troop of horsemen in the distance. They did not notice them, but it became clear that the road to the north was closed. They had to go through the swamps. The journey was difficult. The mud sucked at their feet. The mosquitoes bit relentlessly, and every step was torture. The princess almost drowned when she stumbled, but the squire managed to pull her out. After that, she trembled for a long time, but did not allow her tears to escape. When they reached dry land, they came across a small farmstead. The owner was a sullen peasant, but when he saw the blood on the squire's hands from the cut, he unexpectedly offered his help. He bandaged the wound, fed them bread, and said that he once had a son who looked like the fugitive. He had gone to war and never returned. The peasant added that he hated the duke for his cruelty, and, if necessary, was ready to show them a secret path by which they could leave these places unnoticed. He did this selflessly, and it was his advice that allowed them to escape pursuit for a few more days. But the princess's anxiety grew stronger and stronger. The squire's pendant and the old woman's words in the village came together in a chain of events. She began to understand that her family's past held a secret that could change everything. Night fell while they were on the road. They were walking along a path that led towards the mountains. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and everything around them seemed strange and dangerous. The squire insisted that they keep moving even in the dark. He sensed that their pursuers were close. Around midnight, they stopped at an abandoned mill. The wheels had long since rotted away, and the interior was empty, except for mice rustling in the straw. The princess lay down on the hay, and he remained at the entrance, listening to the forest. Suddenly, he heard someone approaching. The horses snorted as if they sensed danger. He hid, and after a few minutes, he saw the light of torches. The duke's men were searching the area. They passed very close by, and the princess's heart stopped. She lay there, clutching her mother's amulet to her chest, and for the first time seriously thought, maybe they would be caught, and then it would all end tonight. But the squad passed by. The next morning, they were on the road again. The forest grew denser, and the trails became fewer and fewer. The squire realized that they had almost no food left. The coins the old woman had given them were dwindling. He began to wonder whether they should go to a monastery. There, they could be given shelter and food, and at the same time protection. But monasteries often kept in touch with palaces, which meant they could easily be betrayed. A day later, they came across a small monastery shelter that took in the sick and the poor. The abbot was a strict man, but he allowed them to spend the night. He did not ask unnecessary questions, but his gaze was attentive. In the corridors of the shelter, the squire heard the novices talking about the reward for returning the fugitive. He hardly slept that night. The thought kept running through his head. Would they be betrayed? But in the morning, the abbot approached them and unexpectedly gave them a bundle of bread and cheese. He said that he had seen too many princesses turned into prisoners of marriage, and if they had chosen a different path, then let them go. For the squire, this was confirmation that not all people blindly serve the powerful. Sometimes help comes from those you least expect. But with this came a new threat. On the road, they met a caravan of merchants. One of them looked too closely at the girl, and although she hid her face under a hood, her gaze gave her away. In the evening, when they stopped in the forest, the squire heard horses nearby. He realized that the merchants had already reported them, and now the pursuit was back on their trail. They ran until dawn. The horses were exhausted, their breath coming in gasps. For the first time, the princess felt despair. No matter how hard they tried, they would still be found. She said that perhaps it would be better to turn back while there was still time. But the squire replied firmly, there was no turning back. Her tears glistened in the darkness, but she said nothing more. At that moment, she made the final decision to go to the end, even if the road led them to the abyss. A bridge over the river appeared ahead. The planks were rotten, and the water was raging. It was risky to cross, but there was no other way. They made up their minds, and it was there that their first open battle took place. The wind blew in their faces on the bridge, and the planks creaked under the horses' hooves. The river below roared like a beast. They had almost reached the middle when horsemen with torches appeared on the other side. The duke's coat of arms burned on their cloaks. The squire realized there was no retreat. Two more were chasing them from behind, and the trap had closed. He ordered the princess to dismount and hide behind the railing of the bridge. She wanted to protest, but there was such a determined gleam in his eyes that she obeyed. The first enemies rode onto the bridge. The squire grabbed the sword he had been hiding all this time and met them. The boards shook under the blows of steel. He fought not as a servant, but as a warrior. Each of his blows was precise, each movement confident. The princess saw that he wielded his weapon no worse than the knights she knew. At that moment, she realized for the first time that he had a talent that no one had suspected. The fight did not last long. He threw one into the river and wounded the other in the shoulder. The rest retreated, not wanting to risk themselves on the rickety bridge. But the squire could not avoid one blow. A spear cut his side. Blood flowed down his clothes, and he could barely stand. The princess rushed to him, trying to stop the bleeding. The enemies were still hesitating at the other end of the bridge. Then she picked up a torch that was lying on the boards and threw it at the rotten beams. The fire flared up instantly, and soon the entire bridge was engulfed in flames. The horsemen retreated, not daring to go any further. But the price was high. Now they were cut off from the road back, and the squire was seriously wounded. They somehow made it to the other side and fell into the shade of the forest. The princess tore her cloak and bandaged his wound. He was delirious, calling for his mother and repeating words she did not understand. Among them was a name that made her shudder. It was the name of her own mother. She sat next to him all night, listening to his incoherent speech. A feeling grew inside her. Their connection was not accidental. The pendant, the old woman's words, and now this name. Everything pointed to their lives being intertwined more deeply than love or chance. In the morning, he woke up weak but alive. They continued on, leaning on each other for support. A few days later, the road led them to a monastery in the mountains. Here lived brothers who rarely accepted guests, but kept records of the genealogies of noble families. It was here that the princess hoped to find the answers she feared. The abbot greeted them sternly, but when he saw the squire's pendant, he was silent for a long time. Then he said it would be better to talk in the quiet of the scriptorium. At that moment, the princess realized that the truth that would change everything awaited them. The monastery's scriptorium smelled of wax and old leather. Candles burned unevenly, illuminating shelves of books. The abbot seated them at an oak table and placed a scroll in front of them. It contained records of marriages and children of noble families. He said that many years ago a woman had appeared at court. She was the king's wife, but her heart belonged to another. She had given birth to a child that almost no one knew about. The baby was secretly given to a wet nurse to avoid shame and preserve peace in the family. The abbot added that at that time he was still a novice and had witnessed this secret arrival. The princess listened and couldn't believe it. The abbot continued, "The pendant worn by the squire belonged to that woman. It was a token of her love and a memento for the child." The words fell like stones. The princess felt her chest go empty. If all this was true, then the squire was her brother. He himself turned pale when he understood the meaning of what he had heard. His gaze darted between the pendant and the princess's face. Between them stood the shadow of the past, heavy and insurmountable. But the abbot did not say directly that this was the truth. He only showed records and hints. There were dates, but they did not match completely. Doubts remained. Perhaps the squire was the son of another woman from the same family. Perhaps the connection was different. The princess left the scriptorium with trembling hands. She looked at the squire, and inside her, love fought with horror. That same day, the duke's horsemen arrived at the monastery. They demanded that the brothers hand over the fugitives. The abbot ordered the gates to be locked and said that there were no strangers in the monastery. The horsemen left, but promised to return with soldiers. When night fell, the abbot called them again. He said that if they stayed, the monastery would not withstand the assault. But he knew a man who could help. It was one of the knights who many years ago had become disillusioned with the court and gone into exile. Now he lived as a hermit in the mountains, but he had loyal followers. The abbot gave them a letter and ordered them to go to him. He added that this knight had once sworn to protect the princess's mother's family. If he still lived by that oath, he would help. This was the first real benefactor whose help could change everything. They set off at night. The moon lit the way, and every step was difficult. But in their hearts burned the hope that what awaited them ahead was not death, but salvation. The princess walked beside her squire and thought, even if their connection turned out to be familial, she would not allow anyone to separate them. They had already been through too much together. The road to the mountains was long and dangerous. Rocks fell from under their feet, and a cold wind cut their faces. The horses could barely keep up, and soon they had to leave them in the gorge. They climbed on foot, leaning on their staffs, and every step was difficult. On the third day of their journey, they saw a hut nestled against a rock. The roof was made of dark boards, and an old rust-covered shield hung near the wall. When they approached, the door swung open, and a tall man with a gray beard appeared on the threshold. His eyes were stern, but not hostile. He read the abbot's letter and was silent for a long time. Then he said that he had been waiting for this day. He recognized the princess's mother's features in her, and confessed that he had once been her secret ally. He knew about her suffering and the secret of her heart. He offered them refuge. In the mountains, he had people who had also turned away from the duke and the king. They were peasants, hunters, and even former soldiers. They lived in hiding, but were ready to rise up when the time came. For the first time, the princess felt that they were not alone. Here, they were accepted without question and given food, clothing, and warmth. But the squire could not find peace. He was tormented by the abbot's words and the fear that the love he carried might be forbidden. He began to avoid the princess's gaze, keeping his distance, but the same feeling burned in his eyes. Meanwhile, news of the escape had already reached the king himself. The duke demanded the return of his bride, threatening war. The king hesitated. The family's honor was at stake. But he remembered the princess's mother and her tragic fate, and doubt lingered in his heart. In the mountains, life went on as usual. The hermit taught the squire to wield a sword, and it soon became clear that the young man was not born to be a servant. His movements were quick, his strikes precise. People looked at him with respect, and some began to whisper that he had the blood of knights in his veins. One day, a messenger came to their hideout. He was wounded and could barely stand. He said that the Duke's troops were close, and that they intended to burn the villages if the princess did not return. This moment became decisive. The squire realized that their escape was no longer a personal matter. Now ordinary people were in danger. The princess said she could not allow suffering for her sake, but the squire replied that if they surrendered, the suffering would only increase. The hermit suggested a decisive step: to gather people and meet the Duke's troops in the mountains. He said that he had once been exiled, but now it was time to repay the debt. The princess looked at the squire, and a feeling of pride grew inside her. She understood that he was transforming from a simple servant into someone capable of leading others. The mountain paths were narrow, and the Duke's army could not pass in formation. This was an advantage for those who knew every rock and every crevice. The hermit gathered people, peasants with pitchforks, hunters with bows, and a few former warriors. There were no more than 36 of them, but in the mountains even a small force could hold back the enemy. The squire stood next to them. In his hands he held a sword that had once belonged to a knight, and now he held it with confidence. People looked at him and saw not a servant, but a warrior. When the Duke's army entered the gorge, stones flew from above. Horses shied, warriors fell into the river. A battle ensued. In the narrow pass, every blow was decisive. The squire fought at the front. His movements were quick. He parried blows and struck back. At one point, an enemy spear almost pierced him, but he dodged and struck back, knocking the enemy into the mud. His cry inspired the others. The men followed him as if he were their leader. The princess watched from the hill. She saw how he led the others, how there was no fear in his eyes. At that moment, she realized that his place was not in the stables, but among those who decided the fate of others. The battle lasted until sunset. The Duke's warriors retreated, leaving many dead behind. The hermit said he had not expected such strength from the young man. He admitted that he saw in him the legacy of noble blood. But the joy of victory was overshadowed. The Duke would not give up. He would gather new forces and return. People understood that time had been gained, but the war was just beginning. That night, the squire sat silently by the fire. He felt the respectful glances on him, but inside he was tormented by doubts. If he was truly related to the princess's family, what did their love mean? Sin? Fate? Or a test? The princess approached him. She said that to her he was neither a brother nor a servant, but a man to whom she had entrusted her life. She did not want to hear about the past. She chose the present. He remained silent, but her words warmed him. Meanwhile, the hermit spoke to the people, preparing them for a new attack. He said that they had a leader, although the young man himself did not yet realize it. It was on that night that the legend of the underestimated hero was born, who rose above his station and showed strength equal to that of knights and lords. The morning brought alarming news. Scouts reported that the Duke had gathered more warriors and was leading them to the mountains. This time, the forces were much more serious. The people in the camp understood that it would be almost impossible to withstand the onslaught. The princess suggested seeking negotiations. She said she was ready to go to the duke if it would save the villages. But the squire sharply rejected this idea. He said that then their entire journey would be in vain. In the evening, a horseman in a rich cloak rode up to their camp. He was accompanied by 2 warriors, but they left their weapons at the foot of the trail. The horseman introduced himself as the king's messenger. He said he knew where the fugitive was hiding and had come not to take her back by force, but to listen to her. His words sounded like salvation, but also like a threat. No one could tell if it was a trap. Then the princess decided to talk. She went out to him, her heart pounding with fear, but her gaze remained firm. The messenger said that the king had doubts about the marriage to the duke. The duke was too greedy and dreamed of power that could destroy the balance in the kingdom. The princess's escape was a disgrace, but it also opened the king's eyes. He added that the king was willing to forgive her audacity if she agreed to return as a bride, but not to the duke, but to another ally chosen by the king himself. These words were a blow to the squire. He realized that they wanted to use her as a pawn again. But the princess told the messenger that her heart was already taken, and she would not be a victim of other people's deals. The messenger looked closely at the squire. Then he suddenly said that he saw features in him that were familiar to the royal family. He added that if this was true, then the young man had the right to a completely different destiny. This was the intervention of a true benefactor. He did not capture them or betray them to the duke, but instead gave them a chance. He left a letter with the king's seal, according to which they could go to the capital and demand a trial. When the messenger left, silence fell over the camp. The hermit said that now they had a choice, either to hide and prepare for a new battle, or to take a risk and come out of the shadows. The princess looked at the squire. She understood that the final test that would decide their fate lay ahead. The journey to the capital took several days. They were accompanied by the hermit's men, hiding from the duke's pursuers. Every step seemed difficult, because no one knew whether the king would take their side or betray them. The capital greeted them with the noise of the markets and the glitter of the towers. The news of the fugitives had already spread, and a crowd had gathered at the gates. People whispered, some condemning the princess's audacity, others looking at her with secret joy, for everyone knew that the duke was a cruel and greedy man. They were received at the palace without weapons. The king sat on his throne, surrounded by his advisers. His face was stern, but not cruel. He listened to the story of his daughter and her squire. When they showed him the pendant, the king was silent for a long time. Finally, he admitted that the truth about the past had long tormented him. The princess's mother had indeed loved another man, and a child could have been born from this relationship. But the secret had been buried so as not to destroy the throne. The king said that he could not say for sure whether this young man was his wife's son, but the sign of the pendant and the coincidences were too strong to ignore. The duke, summoned to the hall, exploded with rage. He demanded the execution of both of them and called them a disgrace. But at that moment, the messenger who had brought them read a letter with the royal seal. It said that the marriage to the duke was cancelled and that the princess's fate would be decided only by her choice. The people in the hall began to whisper. The duke turned red, but did not dare to disobey. The king rose and said that he was tired of deals that destroy living hearts. He declared that his daughter had the right to decide her own life. The princess stepped forward and said that her choice had already been made. She would point to the one who had been with her in exile, who had defended her at the cost of his own blood. The squire stood pale. He understood that their love could be forbidden if the truth about their relationship was confirmed. But the king said that he had no evidence in his hands, and therefore he would not ruin their fates with guesswork. The decision was made. The princess and the squire were given their freedom. The duke left the palace in a rage, but his power was shaken. The people, hearing of the princess's audacity, began to respect her for her courage. In the days that followed, the squire was rewarded with the title of knight. His past remained a mystery, but his actions spoke louder than blood. People saw him as an underappreciated hero who had risen above all prejudices. The princess held his hand, and all fear left her heart. They had gone through escape, blood, and secrets, and now they could move forward together. Thus ended their story, not with a fairy tale of marriage for profit, but with the truth about the choice of the heart.